It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Well, as you've been hearing on the BBC, at least the U.S. and Iran have pulled back from the kind of mutually assured destruction threats that both sides were issuing over the weekend, right, about attacking civilian energy and water infrastructure all over the region. At least there's that. Of course, that could be a decoy on Trump's part. I don't know if they said that on the BBC, like hoping Iran will let its guard down after being given this 5-day delay in the threat, and then the U.S. will go in harder. We've seen that kind of thing before, haven't we? But if we take Trump's written statement this morning at its word, and I'll say it again, he said the U.S. and Iran, quote, have had over the last 2 days very good and productive conversations regarding a complete and total resolution of our hostilities in the Middle East, unquote. If we take that at its word, I think we have an excellent guest to discuss what might be in productive conversations to end the war. Nate Swanson was a U.S. negotiator with Iran last year for the Trump administration. Before that, he was director for Iran issues at the National Security Council in the Biden administration. So he's got that kind of bipartisan cred, including negotiating with Iran for Trump, though we should say he was fired by Trump in the end. Now he's director of the Iran Strategy Project at the think tank, the Atlantic Council, and he has an article in Foreign Affairs called How America's War on Iran Backfired. Tehran will now set the terms for peace. Nate, we appreciate your time with these latest very high-stakes developments. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you for having me.
Would you give our listeners a little more background on you first? What kinds of negotiations were you involved with for the Trump administration with Iran last year? What was each side trying to achieve when you were there?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a career civil servant from about 2007 to 2025, almost all of it on Iran, which was a questionable life choices, but that's how it worked out. So, I spent the last couple of years of the Biden administration at the White House as the Iran director. And then I kind of came back to state at the change of administration, which was my home agency. And, I kind of figured that was it for my Iran career. But about a month into the administration, I got a call saying, hey, would you like to work with the negotiations team? I said, sure. So I did that through the spring of 2025. And I can talk more about that if that's of interest. And then, I don't want to overplay my role. I was really as a top-down kind of a, Steve Witkoff, President Trump-led initiative, of course. So it's kind of unique to this administration. But then, I left in December of 2025 under Laura Loomer-like circumstances. So, yeah, that's the background.
Laura Loomer, the conspiracy theorist influencer, the New Yorker, if I remember correctly, has also called her Trump's loyalty enforcer. So she thought you were disloyal to Trump. Do you want to give us a very short version of that?
Yeah, no, solely because I was in the Biden NSC. So.
But what were you negotiating? What was Trump and the team that included you trying to negotiate with Iran last year? Obviously, that didn't work out from one side or the other or both since we wound up at war.
Right. So I actually do think it was a good faith effort. I think the Trump administration entered with the ability to do whatever they wanted. I think they had a weak Iran, a relatively weak Iran, and they had an opportunity for diplomacy or more pressure like you did in Trump 1. I think they were all on the table. But I do think there was this relatively serious initiative put forward by Steve Witkoff and the administration. And I think, the terms changed a little bit, but I think fundamentally it was somewhat similar to what was done during the Obama era JCPOA. It was significant nuclear constraints on Iran's nuclear program in return for sanctions relief. So that there was 5 meetings that happened in the spring of 2025. I was involved in some, not all, and some progress was made. I think there was a lot more attention in the press that said, a deal was imminent. That was never the case. We were never that close. But, it was professional conversation. And at some point, though, both the president and Israel kind of ran out of patience, and they kind of went to, the 12-day war in June instead. So, that kind of ran out.
Well, what do you think the deal breakers were on either side or any side that, led to ultimately the U.S. and Israel deciding that war was their best option?
So two things. So from the U.S. perspective, I think, we were trying to find out what our bottom lines were. And I think Trump was very conscious of the fact that he pulled out of the Iran deal that Obama made, the JCPOA. So I think he knew the deal had to look different and frankly be better than what Obama signed on to in 2015, which was not easy. So, it took several rounds to lock in a position, but, he decided that, ultimately he supported a no enrichment policy for Iran, which means, they'd have to fully give up their nuclear program, which is reasonable from a U.S. perspective. I mean, there's no reason for Iran to have this program. There's alternatives. But it was never going to happen. And then I think from Iran's perspective, they were totally beholden to the framework and the details of the deal they made in 2015. It was basically the same people who negotiated then or still around now. And so they basically could not adjust. They could not meet Trump's unique style. I think he wanted to be personally involved in this. They would not do that. And I think, that was a mistake on Iran's part. And, kind of doomed the whole process to failure that neither could really adjust to the other.
Listeners, if you're just joining us, my guest is Nate Swanson, former U.S.-Iran negotiator. He has an article in Foreign Affairs called How America's War on Iran Backfired. Tehran will now set the terms for peace. And if you have any comments or questions specifically on this track, really, that we're on, which is about negotiating with Iran, back on the table now after Trump's post this morning that they've had over the last 2 days, very good and productive conversations regarding a complete and total resolution of our hostilities in the Middle East, unquote. So about negotiating with Iran, 212-433, WNYC, 212-433-9692. You can call or text. We'll also get into his analysis of where the war is militarily, which is also in his article. So now, Nate, to the present. Your article came out before Trump's 48-hour ultimatum Saturday night and Iran's threats in response, and now this pulling back from the brink of either side attacking power plants and water supplies. Did any of this surprise you? Did it fit into a bigger picture of this war that you described in your piece or anything like that? Nate, you there? We lost Nate. All right. So again, well, maybe I'll read from the article a little bit while we're trying to get Nate back here. Again, it's called How America's War on Iran Backfired, and Tehran will now set the terms for peace. And he wrote, and this was late last week, Trump likely wants to declare victory soon. The Iranian military has been severely degraded. Israel may be running low on missile interceptors, and keeping global markets stable will require reopening the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran has declared closed to its enemies, but he cannot force surrender on a government that refuses it. Even after the heavy damage to Iran's military, the regime that Khamenei put in place has powerful incentives to pursue continued conflict, and it retains a variety of tools to sustain a war of attrition. This is why his article is subheaded, Tehran will now set the terms for peace. And he writes, the war is thus barreling toward an inflection point at which all the potential options are bad. To agree to a ceasefire, Tehran will almost certainly demand assurances that the United States will constrain future Israeli strikes on Iran. And he writes, Trump retains substantial leverage over Netanyahu because of Israel's dependence on the U.S. military and its assistance, but it is still a huge ask. And with that, we have Nate back on the phone. Sorry for whatever happened there with the connection. You're there, right?
No problem.
Okay.
Yep, I'm here.
So I'll restate my last question because I don't know if you heard it. It was that your article came out before Trump's 48-hour ultimatum Saturday night and Iran's threats in response, and now this pulling back from the brink of either side attacking civilian power plants and water supplies. And my question was, did any of this surprise you? Did it fit into a bigger picture of this war in any way that you describe in your piece or had in your mind?
Yeah, it follows a pattern, right, from the Trump administration perspective from the beginning, which is this approach that Iran should capitulate. As long as the U.S. puts more pressure on Iran, that Iran will at some point just have to give in and, meet the president's demands. So that's been a pattern, really. Definitely this war, but even back to last year in the June war, right? With the 12-day war, the president took, this incredible actions and had no repercussions. So, so I think that's been his assumption the whole time that, this was supposed to be a 4-day war. And, he's expected at different times, the regime collapse, total surrender, picking the supreme leader, all these different iterations, which aren't going to happen. So, maximalist threats have kind of been the U.S. MO on this, and that hasn't changed. And Iran, for their part, is considers this sort of an existential. They believe this is an existential threat, and probably correctly, and feels like they need to take the most aggressive actions possible. And so that's what we're seeing. So the idea of striking a civilian nuclear program or civilian energy program is extremely concerning on multiple fronts. And I think, Iran threatening to retaliate in kind, including hitting, desalinization plants in the Gulf, would just really mean a really stark escalation on both sides. I think we're entering into new territory. So I think, it's good, hopefully, that both sides are seeking an off-ramp at this point, because I think anything that goes on from here is diminishing returns really for both sides. And so I'm not 100% sure we'll be able to get a ceasefire out of this, but I think it is in both sides' interest to wrap this up.
Listener texts, Trump lying today to calm markets. There are no negotiations. Do you think that's true? That's a listener speculation, but do you think that might be true?
I think part of the messaging is directly aimed at the market. I think that part is accurate. And there's been a number of messages focused on the market. But I do think, the longer this goes on, the worse it gets for the global economy, the worse it gets for the U.S. economy, for the American taxpayer. So I do think there's probably a strong incentive on the U.S. side to actually seek an off-ramp right now. I think the same applies to Iran as well, even though they're kind of denying it publicly. They're kind of at their maximum leverage point here, and anything that goes on from here is diminishing returns. So I tend to think it's genuine on both sides to hopefully wrap this up, but, I can't say for sure. And, look, the alternative is, that we have more military on the way to the region. It's possible this is just a delay or a head fake to buy more time for those people to arrive. I suppose that's possible, but I hope that's not the case.
So for you, as someone who was involved with Trump administration negotiations with Iran, to the post that says they've had productive conversations regarding a resolution, what could be a negotiated resolution to stop the fighting?
Yeah, it depends who you ask. I think from the U.S. side, the clear number one priority now is the free flow of commerce through the Strait of Hormuz, which, Iran has effectively stymied. So, that's a clear objective from the U.S. side, and I think that is probably attainable. I think Iran wants two things, and we'll come back to what this means for the U.S. in a second. So they want, first and foremost, is some kind of guarantee that this won't be a war that happens every 6 months. I think that this is the lesson they learned from the last June strike, which was, they sought a quick off-ramp, and, the U.S. and Israel are back at it again 8 months later. So they don't want to do this again. They don't want to fight tomorrow's war in 6 months. They'd rather do it now for a longer period of time. So they're looking for something that, makes this an enforceable ceasefire, or just some kind of guarantee that it won't happen again.
I also
so that's not easy.
Go ahead.
But go ahead. Well, I think the second thing they're want is some kind of in their words, financial compensation. And so what we saw on Friday, the Trump administration unsanctioning Iranian vessels on the water for the first time, really symbolically quite important. It's the first time Iran's been able to sell or have the U.S. buy oil since 1995. That's not even something the JCPOA allowed. So it's symbolically quite important and quite significant. So I think Iran is hoping for some kind of continuation of this as well. So that's what Iran wants. I don't know exactly what the U.S. wants beyond the Strait of Hormuz, but I imagine there's other things they want as well.
Yeah, and I've heard something about Iran downgrading the enrichment level of some of its existing uranium as something that might be in negotiations that the U.S. could portray as a victory. Does that sound plausible to you?
Yeah, prior to the war, there was 3 rounds of negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, and what Iran put on the table was taking their stockpile of highly enriched uranium, it's enriched to 60%, so close to weapons grade, and they were offering to basically downblend it to restart enrichment and move it to a lower level. So that's basically put on the table. It's a significant but short-term benefit, and I think the U.S. should have good questions about whether that's all of the, HEU that Iran's offering, but that was essentially the deal that was on the table as I understand it, prior to the war. So it's certainly conceivable something like that will be in play again.
Another listener texts, Trump clearly wants an off-ramp. Israel does not. Regime collapse is useful, meaning useful to Israel, and Iran hurts GCC adversaries too, Gulf Cooperation Council adversaries, the Gulf Arab states. See today, the listener continues, see today, Trump announced moratorium on hitting Iran's energy infrastructure while Israel is out bombing the infrastructure. And you wrote in your article that to agree to a ceasefire, Tehran will almost certainly demand assurances that the United States will constrain future Israeli strikes on Iran, and Iran could frame that as a triumph. So talk about the whole U.S.-Israel dynamic here and how much they may be on the same or different tracks at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Iran wants. That's not what I'm advocating for. I think we approach this, the U.S. and Israel, with different objectives in mind. I think for Israel, this is really, kind of goes back to the October 7 attacks, where they're no longer willing to take what they had one time been perceived as, these threats against Israel that you could kind of live with. They feel like they can't live with anymore. So Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran have said, death to Israel and something along those lines. That's just no longer acceptable. So I think for Israel, this is, understandably much more existential, and I do think they're seeking a regime collapse at some point. For the U.S., I mean, my contention is that I really think the U.S. thought this would be easy. This would be like the strike last June, a big U.S. action, quick out, no repercussions. Same thing with the Maduro operation in January. Really same thing to when the U.S. Trump 1 killed Qasem Soleimani, the IRGC Quds Force commander. There's really no repercussions. So my understanding here is going in, the U.S. thought this was, they had a model that worked to be easy, and then they would be out in 3 or 4 days. It obviously didn't happen. I thought it was a huge miscalculation of where Iran was, but that, that I think was the motivation. And so that's obviously very different than what Israel wants. And I think, there was shared motivation for getting in, but what the end state looks like is probably quite different at this point now.
Here's another text from a listener who writes, didn't Trump brag about how he blew up everyone that he could possibly negotiate with? Who are we even talking to with regards to negotiations? And here's the clip that I think the listener is referring to. This is very short. It was Trump on Friday night.
We're having a hard time. We want to talk to them, and there's nobody to talk to. We have nobody to talk to. And you know what? We like it that way.
So that sounds like just more bluster, but do you think there was any there to that actually indicates that it's difficult to know who to negotiate with, and that may be hampering actual negotiations?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, in terms of many of the stalwarts of the Iranian regime, people the U.S. government knew well, the people that we were somewhat predictable to us to an extent, are dead. That's just accurate. Not all of them, but it's a lot of them, including the supreme leader, of course, and then the guy who's kind of the de facto head afterwards, who's since been eliminated, Ali Larijani. These were guys that are kind of well known and are somewhat predictable, somewhat, and a lot of them are dead. So there's no doubt. Now, look, what we are seeing after the conflict, though, is there is a decentralized but relatively coherent governance. I don't know, and I don't think most people, maybe even the U.S. government, know who's actually making the final decisions in Iran right now. But there are decisions being made, and I think you're seeing relatively stable command and control. And so I don't think Iran would freelance on this. And so if they're indicating they're willing to talk, I think they'll send out someone they trust who will be an implementer of their policy. And so I don't know who that person is right now or who those people are. It's probably more than one, but I do think there are people who clearly are making decisions in Iran. And so if they're ready to talk, they'll talk. On
the Israel track, they have this expanding offensive in and around Beirut, taking an immense civilian casualty toll as they try to wipe out Iran-backed Hezbollah once and for all, like there has been, of course, such an immense civilian casualty toll in Gaza as Israel tries to destroy Hamas. There's the big moral question of how much civilian death and destruction for how much additional security. But there's also the military question of, will this actually end attacks into Israel from across the Lebanon border? Do you have a take?
Yeah, so it's a mixed take. So I think on one hand, if you look at Israel's attacks on Lebanon in 2024, they were quite successful. They took out Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, and his senior leadership, and it really did seem like it had an almost like neutering effect on Hezbollah's ability to project power. That was my assumption coming into the war, and I thought in some ways Israel was trying to repeat that same approach with Iran for this war. We're seeing probably a stronger response from Hezbollah than I anticipated, which maybe leads me to question whether it was as effective a military campaign as possible. And I think, and as we compare it to Hamas, you can kill people, you can degrade abilities, but there's an ideology still there. It's hard to fully eradicate it, and it's hard to have, lasting military victories that don't have some kind of political settlement on the back end that locks in like operational gains and strategic gains. So it's hard to have a military only victory here, and I'm skeptical that happens in any of those theaters.
Right, ideology and also very deep sense of grievance on the part of the Palestinian people that might lead to new generations of revolts against Israel, whether it's called Hamas or something else. So what's your take on Israel's military with respect to Iran itself? You wrote that Israel may be running low on missile interceptors, and that was before the missile strike yesterday that was the worst of the war so far, that injured a reported 180 people in Arad in southern Israel. So what's your take on how much that was a fluke versus a sign of things to come, given what each side has left?
Yeah, I don't know. There's been conflicting reports on Israel's capability in terms of missile interceptors and not. So, at one point Israel said they were running low, and then they denied it. So it's hard for me to say definitively what's true. There is, a key variable in all this is there is just an actual numbers game for both sides in terms of, munitions that Iran has available in terms of missiles and drones, and, interceptors on the back end for Israel and for the Gulf countries. And, I don't have great insight into who has more. I think both sides have a understandable desire to make it seem like they have more, and I don't know what's true or not. But the risk is for both sides is that you're on the losing end of those numbers, and when that happens, you have real problems. So,
right,
and both sides might not have total clarity into what the other has. So hopefully that pushes towards an end sooner than later.
I should say you're not shy about criticizing Iran in your article. You cite Iran's 70% inflation rate for food over the last year and its chronic electricity and water shortages, and you blame them in large part on Iran's foreign policy designed to counter U.S. interests. Can you draw that link for us? How had Iran's foreign policy caused food prices to spike that much domestically?
Yeah, sure. So, Islamic Republic's been around for 47 years now at this point, or almost 47. And basically, the hallmark of the regime has been, one of them has been kind of this counter-America, counter-Israel policy. And so so that meant, arming proxies, developing a nuclear program. And over time, you had, very significant sanctions put in place by the U.S., by Europe, by others that have basically tried to use those tools as leverage to get Iran to change their foreign policy. And, it's just had over time, just a crippling effect on the Iranian ability to provide for their own people. And, you cited the stats, right? I mean, it's 75% food increases over the last year. It's inflation over 40% the last 6. And the rial, the Iranian currency, it used to be, at the time of the revolution, it was 70 rials to $1. I think it's something like 1.3 million rials to the dollar now. So, I mean, it's just total devaluation of the currency. And so, these are a direct result of their foreign policy. So the hope was that when the supreme leader died, Ali Khamenei, is that a future leader would have to look at Iran's decision-making, how they interacted with the U.S., how they interacted with the region, including Israel, and say, hey, this is not the right path forward for me. And so the irony of this situation, unfortunately, is we are delaying that decision at best, if not for, years, potentially decades. And we're empowering the most hardline elements in Iran who are not going to look critically at that question and instead going to focus on security. So the hope in all of this is at some point some will be pragmatic enough to change their approach and say, hey, wait, I want my country to succeed. We need to actually change our foreign policy, but I don't think it's going to happen in the short term.
So to conclude, does that relate to the title of your article, How America's War on Iran Backfired? Yeah,
it does. I think Iran was probably, in my estimation, at its lowest point in January. In January, the Iranian regime went out and killed thousands, potentially tens of thousands of their own people who were protesting just for better life, essentially. And my hope was, at that point, you had this Iran that was weakened militarily, was weakened domestically, economically, and a supreme leader who had cancer and was 86 and would hopefully die at some point, and that when he died, there was the opportunity for a new future, a new decision making. And I just unfortunately think we might be further away from that now. And I think I do think the war has backfired a little bit.
Nate Swanson was a U.S. negotiator with Iran last summer for the Trump administration. Before that, he was director for Iran issues at the National Security Council in the Biden administration. He's now director of the Iran Strategy Project at the think tank, the Atlantic Council, and his article in Foreign Affairs is called How America's War on Iran Backfired. Tehran will now set the terms for peace. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Since WNYC's first broadcast in 1924, we've been dedicated to creating the kind of content we know the world needs. Since then, New York Public Radio's rigorous journalism has gone on to win a Peabody Award and a DuPont Columbia Award, among others. In addition to this award-winning reporting, your sponsorship also supports inspiring storytelling and extraordinary music that is free and accessible to all. To get in touch and find out more, visit sponsorship.wnyc.org.